Welcome to Socialism 101 and the Democratic Socialists of America. My name is John. I am the chair of the Education Committee, and it's our job to educate our members and prospective members and make the case for socialism. So that's what we're going to do today. You've all heard of socialism, I'm sure, and a definition of socialism is complicated and maybe not super productive. Ask two leftists and they'll give you two different ideas of what socialism is. But what we're interested in here is just sort of providing like a maximally acceptable. I don't know if you all remember Jeff Foxworthy, the comedian who used to have those jokes where the premise was you might be a redneck if. This is kind of like that. Like if you agree with a lot of what I'm going to say here, then you might be a socialist. So what is socialism? Socialism is, it's a body of thought. It's a transitory state on the way to communism, or if you take it super broadly, it's a social and economic system in which the economy, the politics, and the culture are democratically organized in a way that benefits all of society. Socialism, the need for socialism or the desire for it doesn't arise in a vacuum. It's maybe best understood as the solution to a problem. And as we all might be beginning to grasp, the problem is capitalism. So to understand socialism, unfortunately, you have to understand capitalism, and we're going to do a little bit of that today. What is capitalism? So capitalism is, again, there are technical economic definitions, there are technical Marxist definitions, but you may be a socialist if you believe that what defines capitalism is that a small group of people, the capitalist class or the ruling class, owns the means of production, which means, in Marx's day, it meant the Victorian guy with the top hat who owned the factory where the children would work 14-hour days or whatever it was. In our society, it can mean buildings, machinery, it can mean technology, it can mean patents, the ability to charge $8,000 a dose for an AIDS medication. These are factors of production, so these are things that are used in economic activity which are sort of necessarily scarce. And that's why the people who own them can sort of hold them hostage or hold them ransom and charge whatever they want for their use. So because they control these resources, they get to decide who keeps the profits from production. And generally, they choose themselves as the people who keep the profits. So the other part of the equation is workers. Workers are a necessary part of production. They're a necessary factor of production. But since all they bring to the production process is their own labor, they're generally sort of interchangeable, replaceable, and as individuals, they're at a disadvantage in negotiating, obviously. One person who all they can do is, not show up to work that day and fulfill their function as a sort of cog in a machine, they don't have a ton of leverage over the capitalist who owns the factory or... So capitalism, as opposed to socialism, is a social and economic system in which the engine of the economy is the accumulation of profits. Essentially, this means that nothing happens in a capitalist economy unless there's going to be profit in it for somebody. This is sort of, it's almost like a, it's essentially definitional. Your employer wouldn't hire you to show up for work if he were going to break even on that transaction. There'd be no reason. If you're a rich person and you're sitting at home and you're thinking, what am I going to do with my money? You're not going to start a business and amass a workforce and produce a product and then come out with zero profit, because it's just not worth your time to get up in the morning. This isn't really like a moral critique necessarily. It's just a fact. Profits are the basis of economic activity under the capitalist system. And profits, of course, are what capitalists use to sort of reinvest and expand their production, and there's kind of a vicious cycle in which profits turn into capital, which turns into more profits, and fortunes tend to amass that way. And under capitalism, workers, for this same reason, necessarily produce, the value of what they produce is necessarily greater than the value of what they get in return. They are exploited It's a Marxist term, but you don't need to sign on to the whole Marxist program to see that if you're not getting paid the full value of what you're producing, you are in some sense exploited. Maybe it's it's not exactly slavery. It's also not exactly a fair transaction on both sides. So, whatever else capitalism is, and critics of capitalism have always been able to accept and admit that capitalism is an incredibly productive system. Marx was one of the first people to point out how many ways it was a huge advance over feudalism, for example, which was in turn a huge advance over slavery. And we can't deny that capitalism has built a lot of the world that we see around us, but whatever else it is also a system of oppression because it's based on this exploitation of workers. And the exploitation of workers is not something that you can just opt out of. You're part of the system whether you like it or not. So you could call this wage slavery. It's a slightly confrontational term to some people, but essentially, you know that you can't opt out of capitalism. You know that you can't just decide that you would prefer to starve to death rather than sell your labor to a capitalist. So while no one capitalist controls you in the largest possible sense, you're subject to this system no matter what. And then once you do sign on with a capitalist and you enter this employment relation, you're at the mercy of your boss. There's no democracy in the workplace, and you do what your boss says or you lose your job. So we've all been in workplaces. I guess actually some of us are a little young, but most of us have been in workplaces where we experience that sort of authoritarian rule where what our boss says goes, and we accept a kind of authority that if it took place in our life as a public citizen, or if our government even treated us in this way, we would riot in the streets. And a side effect of all this is that unprofitable work ends up going undone. If there's no profit in it for a capitalist or for the capitalist class, then projects don't get undertaken, investments don't get made, and no matter how socially beneficial a program is, it doesn't get done. This is sort of a last-minute addition. You might not have seen this, Andre, but this is a graph of the share of income of the top 1% over about the last 100 years. So you can see over there on the left, there's this peak. That's basically the Great Gatsby is happening at that point. And here, World War II is happening. Here, Eisenhower, and I think Eisenhower's president, and the top income tax rate is 91%. And then we have sort of social democracy and great society. And then 1980, Ronald Reagan gets elected, and things change. And we'll come back to this in a second. But when you look at the top 1% and where they get their income from, the majority of that is capital income. The majority of that is income from either directly owning businesses or having large-scale investments in the stock market, which is sort of a distributed ownership of capital. So what does this mean? Because workers, which is essentially the other 99% of society, because they don't own the means of production, they have no control over what's produced or how the profits they create are invested. When you don't have control over what's produced or how you produce it, this is what it means to be alienated from your labor. So you're forced by circumstances to work, but you have no control over how your labor is used. And I mean, many of us, I know I've had jobs where I couldn't afford to even use the thing that my business was engaged in producing. We've all had jobs where we are not the customer and we can't even imagine being able to afford being the customer. And even on a smaller scale, alienation is I had a really good note about alienation. But essentially, like a small craftsperson or an independent producer, you have your hands on the job. You get to decide how it's best done. You get to decide when you work. In fact, this is sort of legally enshrined in employment law. Like right now, a lot of employers will try to screw you out of your benefits by turning you into an independent contractor for tax purposes or benefits purposes. But even in capitalist employment law, if you don't decide when to work and how to work, then you're an employee. So alienation is kind of written into the employment relation. What else does this mean? This means that technological advances are used to increase profit rather than decrease the need to work. So 80, 100 years ago, mainstream economists were predicting that by now we would of course be working 20 hours a week, if that, because of all this fantastic increase of productivity that's going on around us. And productivity has hugely increased. In fact, if we were in more of a mood for graphs, there's a great graph that shows sort of a 45-degree angle line, the increase of productivity, worker productivity over the last century. And then at some point, right around, actually a little before 1980, the wages made by workers, they follow that line and then they just flatten out. And above that, there's this triangle where employers are capturing all that gain in productivity and turning it into profit for themselves. So that's how we, even now, when we're phenomenally productive and surrounded by all this amazing technology, we're still working 40 plus hours a week because all of that money is going to someone other than the workers. Under this system, also, nothing is safe from the pursuit of profit. Everything that can be commodified becomes commodified. Everything from the environment to human relationships ends up turned into commodities in order to create ever greater profits for capitalists. And as said before, work that is unprofitable is unrewarded. There's a current of socialist feminism or feminist socialism that points out that things like reproductive labor and emotional labor and household labor are all unrewarded by the market. And not only are they unrewarded by the market, but because our society tends to only afford respect to things that are market-based, they also go sort of unrespected. And capitalism, in order to sort of perpetuate itself, it includes a few odd beliefs. One of those beliefs is that more choice necessarily means more freedom. Now, on the face of it, that seems reasonable, but sort of capitalist thought ends up pursuing it down this weird alley where more markets mean more choices, and therefore more markets equal more freedom. So if you can get more capitalists producing something, you therefore are more free because you have more brands to shop at the store. You have more choices in the aisle at the grocery store. But of course, socialists would point out that being presented with choices does not mean you have the ability to act on any of these choices. So I don't know if you all remember Paul Ryan when he was talking about his garbage healthcare bill, was saying that freedom meant the ability to buy what you need. Freedom in a capitalist system is the ability to buy the product that you think you need. And he's talking about the ability to buy healthcare, and he's talking about the ability to buy an insurance policy that's literally unaffordable for most ordinary people. So in the capitalist ideology, that's freedom. And if you can't afford it, that's some kind of fact of nature that is, beyond our capacity to fix. A socialist might counter that if you can't afford it, it's not a viable choice. And I think Bernie Sanders talked about that during his campaign as well. And we would also counter that there's much more to freedom than voluntary market transactions. For example, we have the freedom to accept employment with any employer we want. We have a sort of limited freedom to sign on to that authoritarian relationship. But just because something is, at the moment of decision, voluntary doesn't mean it's free. It doesn't mean you're not being coerced into it. I mean, the condition of wage slavery means you're coerced into accepting employment no matter what. Another one of the underlying beliefs is that incentives are necessary to get people to work. And that makes sense. But unfortunately, under capitalism, that means that profits are necessary to get people to invest. So like we said, obviously beneficial things like alternative energy will just be overlooked, will be underinvested or not invested in at all if there are no profits yet or no profits ever to be made in them. Which is why things like alternative energy need to be supported under our current system with sort of tax incentives and tax cuts, because it's much more profitable, unfortunately, to burn fossil fuels. And one of the sort of central myths of capitalism is that competition, not cooperation, is the engine of productivity, which is kind of just a rationalization, but selfishness in capitalism is a virtue. I mean, this is something that goes back to Adam Smith and the earliest economists talking about how it's, if you think about it, it is sort of miraculous that people competing for scarce resources, that sort of competition where everybody just looks out for themselves, it can lead to a great increase in productivity, which is what we saw, 200 years ago. But unfortunately, selfishness has become not a pernicious force that we need to recognize that, hang on, this might not be the best way to fuel our economy, and it's become a virtue unto itself. And a sort of corollary to that is that creative destruction, or disruption, as Silicon Valley calls it, is sort of the price of progress. It's too bad if taxi drivers are all unemployed now. It's too bad if Airbnb has wrecked the housing market, because these things are the price of progress. There's money to be made, and this is just how the capitalist engine works. One of the other beliefs is that there's equal opportunity for all, and that sort of is the best you can offer people. But that opportunity is really just opportunity to compete with one another. So one of the Central American myths is social mobility, which means you can be born at one sort of level of income or level of wealth, and you can, through hard work and industrious application of capitalism, you can move up and you can change your relative position in society. But unfortunately, that's all social mobility is changing the sort of ranking, changing where you lie on the ranking of, rich to poor. So that even if meritocracy on the level that capitalists like to believe it exists, even if it did exist on that level, even if it were not largely an illusion, it's still only a good deal for the winners. If you're going to move from the 30th percentile in income to the 90th, somebody else is coming down to match that. There's no recognition of, or there's no mechanism by which that kind of mobility increases everybody's well-being. So for DSA, and for many of us in the organization, the sort of core problem with capitalism is not so much that certain people have less than other people have materially. It's not so much about how much money you make and how much more money someone else makes. For us, the problem with capitalism and the appeal of socialism has to do with freedom. Under capitalism, the vast majority of people are not free to decide what they do with their time, or how they do it, or whether it's worth doing in the first place. I mean, this is alienation in a nutshell. And you spend the majority of your working hours doing something that you might not agree with, and that, how many of us have had a job where we know better than our boss does how it should be done, but we don't have the freedom to act on that, right? And again, if we've all had jobs where we can't afford what we're producing, we've also all had, we know many people have had jobs where they're doing something that's kind of socially problematic in the first place. There are people who are, I don't want to go too far down the road of apologizing for people's place in industries like private prisons, but let's say you're a construction worker and you're building a private prison. You have no freedom to, turn down that request. That may be the only thing that's going on in your town or in your region. A lot of people by the sort of necessity of employment, get dragged into doing things that they don't think should be done in the first place. The great illusion of capitalism and the great sort of American mythology of capitalism is that it's not just the freest system, but it is in some way identical with freedom. But under capitalism, as we said, you're not free to opt out. You submit yourself to a capitalist employer, or you starve, essentially. And even the capitalists themselves, nothing's going to change because Jeff Bezos decides that he's actually going to pay everybody what they're producing, and there's going to be no more taking of that surplus. No capitalist is free to opt out of the system either because they go out of business. They can't suddenly decide that the profit motive doesn't apply to them and that they don't need to be able to make the numbers add up. And I don't know if this is worst of all, but it's true that most of us don't even understand why we're not free in this system. Many of us have had arguments with our uncle at Thanksgiving or something, and you should just quit complaining, and this is just how it is. You gotta buck up, and this is life. We've sort of come to believe that these peculiarities of the capitalist system are facts of life, almost on the level of laws of physics, and that the world can't work any other way. But society is just a structure that human beings have sort of collectively built. And if we had the power to collectively build it, then we have the power to change it. A la socialism. So in our view, democratic socialists of America, and that democratic is there for a reason, socialism is the path to real substantive freedom for all, not just for the rich and powerful. So we all know that the rich have different legal rights than we do. They can afford expensive lawyers and get themselves out of trouble. They can afford to, sue people who criticize them and drive them into poverty. They also, just by virtue of having more money, have more options and more ability to do mundane things like decide to fly to Fiji or whatever. That's maybe not the kind of freedom that we're going to fight for, but socialists seek to return the wealth of society to the people as a whole so that we can democratically decide what to do with it. There's another graph coming up that you'll see that it's the wealth of society is incredibly concentrated in a very few hands. And on a sort of day-to-day level about human activity rather than possession of resources, when the means of production are owned and controlled by the workers, they can decide what to do with the surplus value. So we can decide, obvious things like that solar power is probably more desirable than fossil fuels, things like that. So yeah, instead of giving our surplus labor or the value of our surplus labor to the capitalist as profits, we could choose to work less. Some people might choose to work less because they're going to do work that is unrewarded by the market. Or we could collectively invest this profit in things that benefit society. We might need a huge investment to deal with the effects of climate change that's already coming, and we may need to be able to decide as a society that we're going to devote the resources that it takes to do that. So rather than the endless pursuit of individual profit and this sort of competition to get a slice of that profit, a socialist economy would be designed to best fulfill human needs. By human needs, we mean things like food and housing. And when you are less focused on working 40, 50, 60 hours a week to secure your food and housing, you can devote your time and energy to living a more dignified and fulfilling life. I'm sure most people in this room can empathize with the idea of having something else that they would rather be doing with their time, and that they honestly feel, maybe you're an artist, maybe you're some sort of craftsperson, maybe you are a religious person, somebody who thinks that they could be making the world a better place in a way that doesn't go through employment for money. And socialism, sort of at its birth, there's a lot of stuff in Marx about profits and investment, but there's a lot of stuff in Marx too about how humans are driven to be productive and how it's sort of in our nature to make things and to create things, and that if we just had the freedom to express those needs in the way that we see fit instead of at the direction of a sort of factory shop manager, it's not that we're going to live forever without doing any work. It's just that we're gonna do meaningful creative work instead of sort of mindless machine age work. And of course, as socialists, if freedom and dignity for all is our goal, then we can't rest just on equalizing people's incomes or changing the marginal tax rates or sharing the profits from capital more equally. We seek also to eliminate all other forms of oppression. And it's the problem with capitalism for us is that it enables the people who have the money and who have the capital to exert power over each other. And there are areas of life where there are other kinds of oppression and other kinds of unjustified power that are exerted over people. And we want to end those too. Class oppression, gender oppression, the whole list is right there. And some of these things we do think are, in a complicated way, tied in with economic issues. But then there are ones that are outside of it that we need to be able to address on their own terms. So by creating a democratic economy, we protect democratic government from manipulation by the capitalist class. I don't think it's news to anyone in this room that if you have a lot of money, you can essentially buy the political outcomes that you desire. It's supposed to be one person, one vote, but it's in reality a lot more like $1, one vote. So for DSA and for democratic socialists in general, socialism and democracy are not opposed. That's sort of one of the objections you hear a lot, is that socialism is undemocratic and constrains people's individual freedom. In our view, they're not opposed at all. They reinforce each other. There's no real democracy without socialism. And there can't be real socialism without democracy. You can't have a tiny elite deciding that it's going to take the productive capacities of society and decide how to distribute them. These two things have to go hand in hand, in our opinion. Our current system is formally democratic. We have elections. We have representation. We know where to go to vote, and we have pretty decent legal protections for securing our votes, but we have a long way to go towards substantive democracy. And we do think that reducing inequality of income and wealth will reduce that inequality of political power. How do we do this? DSA is a big tent or a multi-tendency organization. There are many interpretations of socialism, and we open the door to people who sort of want to dip their toe into socialism, and we have some extremely hardcore, probably communists in the organization who want nothing less than, full communism. There's a sort of blurry line between social democrats and democratic socialists. So Bernie Sanders calls himself a democratic socialist. You could argue that he's a social democrat. But all these disagreements in the short term are sort of disagreements about strategy and about tactics. They're not, what we want ultimately is not to build some kind of crazy machine that sits on top of capitalism and spits out more equal outcomes. We think that it would be more efficient and fairer to actually change the way the sort of engine works and to change the system itself. But there are small steps along the way that we can take. It hasn't worked out very well for leftist organizations who have just decided to hunker down and wait for the revolution to come. So there are steps we can take towards socialism that we know we're pointed in the right direction. Reduce wealth and income inequality. That means defending progressive taxation where it's under attack. It means introducing more progressive taxation. It means taxing wealth at the same level that we tax income, whereas right now it's either untaxed or sort of, capital gains are taxed at half the level of wage income, which is a whole other wonky discussion that we don't need to have. We want to democratize the workplace. This can mean a lot of things. In practice, the most obvious first step is to strengthen unions. If you look at that graph, that U-shaped graph, and you flipped it over, it would be essentially a graph of the power of unions. Unions were at their strongest in the middle of the century. They were at their weakest 100 years ago when union activists were actually being, literally murdered en masse. And we haven't had as much of that kind of overt violence lately, but unions are weaker than they've ever been. And even just the recognition for why a union is good is kind of at an all-time low. I was born in the 70s, so I'm a little older than a lot of our membership, and I've been able to see over my lifetime. When I was young, it was just taken for granted that you don't cross a picket line, that if the local grocery store is on strike, they are in the right, because this is the only thing they can do to fight for their rights. It's a lot easier now to find well-meaning people who nevertheless think, hang on, aren't unions corrupt and undemocratic? And there are criticisms you can make of unions, but unions need to be a much more central piece of this puzzle than they have been. We also want to democratize politics, meaning expand popular participation and power over government. Again, what this means is ending the ability of corporations to buy the political outcomes they want, ending the idea that a corporation is a person for the purposes of free speech. And the more public provision of basic goods, the better, as far as socialists are concerned. So if we can decommodify things like healthcare, education, and food, sort of end the attack on public schooling, I think we all know that something like Medicare for all, or something like the UK's National Health Service even, would be a huge improvement over what we have now, which is your health outcomes are directly tied to what you can afford to pay for. And in Seattle and in many cities right now, housing is a huge issue. There should be more tenant protection, there should be more regulation of the housing market in general, and there should be more public provision of housing. Public housing in the United States has long meant, poor housing. It doesn't have to be that way. And to the extent that housing is an investment rather than a basic human need, it's not serving the needs of the people if it becomes a vehicle for speculation. And all of these functions have to be democratically accountable. So unfortunately for the small government libertarian people, the best way for us to take public control of things at the moment is via government. So you may have also noticed that socialism is making a big comeback. I would imagine that most DSA members were born, right around here, and that many of us are living through a time when we can expect to do worse than our parents did for the first time in several generations. And you can see that as the top 1%, as their income share gets up to sort of unprecedented levels. This was in the New York Times like last week. So the gray graph, the gray line on the graph, is how gains in income were distributed across society in 1980. So you can see that the very poorest people in society, their income was going up at 3% a year. And the richest people, their income was only going up at, 1.4% a year. In 2014, this is absurd. The poorest people are making no gains. Almost everybody is making less gains than they would have in 1980. And then from, maybe the 97th percentile on up, it's just a rocket. So we've heard that there's been an economic recovery since the financial crisis, but it's been incredibly concentrated in very few hands. And there was sort of some follow-on commentary to this, to the effect that that is gains from capital. That's capital income. The top of society isn't getting paid an enormous amount of money because they're incredibly productive workers and extremely intelligent. It's because they own the things that they can extract the profits from. So what can Seattle DSA do about all this? We could hunker down and wait for the revolution, or we could get out there. We were a big part of the Tax the Rich income tax initiative, which was that sponsored by Transit Riders Union, Andre? Yeah, it was sponsored by Transit Riders Union, but there's a lot of crossover in membership and coalition. There you go. And as you can see, we had some of our highly intelligent DSA members speaking on behalf of this initiative, and we count it as a pretty big win for us. People got out there, made the case, they got in city council's face, they got in the public's face, and on what is honestly, tax policy is probably the most boring thing you can develop a taste for, but They put in the work, and they made it happen. DSA, in general, is not hugely focused on electoral politics. You may have noticed that 2 political parties pretty much run things. But we have been highly involved in the John Grant campaign. John Grant is running for city council. He is a DSA member now. He became a DSA member. I don't want to speak for him, but it happened during his campaign, and I have to imagine it had something to do with seeing the support he got from DSA members. And we support the Nikita Oliver campaign as well and endorse Nikita Oliver for mayor. So on the left, I think that's people phone banking for John Grant, and on the right, that is people assembling in the park before they go out canvassing and door knocking for John Grant. So in Seattle, we're lucky to have realistic and supportable local candidates that a socialist can feel good about voting for and working for. We also think that, again, I'm a little older. I remember when being a socialist meant you were, a Russian spy or something. We need to, and we have been somewhat successful already in sort of reclaiming the idea of socialism as something that, normal, caring, thoughtful people can be. A part of that is visibility, and so we've been out there. We have a community service committee. On the right, this is the Low Income Housing Institute. So Carl, I think that's you actually.
Yeah, that's my ass.
Carl got out there and busted his ass for the Low Income Housing Institute. They were doing some landscaping for some of their projects. And then on the left is our trail maintenance day. We drove up to Mount Baker and did some work on some trails for the Washington Trails Association. And we did some sort of collective self-organizing to figure out how to move a bunch of dirt. We can also do some sort of awareness raising and fundraising. This is did this end up being a bowling thing or a trivia thing in the end? It was going to be a bowling team and ended up being a trivia team, but they raised a ton of money for the Council on American Islamic Relations. And then there was also, different care.
This care provides support for people who are seeking abortions. It's very confusing.
That is an extremely different care. But that's also good. And then there was also the Mary's Place donation drive, which was giving feminine products to Mary's Place, which is an organization that helps women who have been, women and their families who have been affected by domestic abuse. So that was also incredibly successful and just a good way to get people out there in their fancy red t-shirts doing good in the community rather than, leftists also have kind of a reputation for being the guys who sit in the back of the cafe and just talk about how rotten America is. We've proven not only that we're not only guys, but also that we get out of the cafe and we try concretely to make the world a better place when we can. And part of supporting labor is not just talking about how important labor is, but it's actually concretely supporting them. Who went to this event and can say more about it?
This was a picket line, an informational picket line, not a strike, by SEIU 1199 Northwest at Harborview. That's the union for the nurses there and at some of the other hospitals in the region. The nurses at Harborview were requesting more protections for their breaks, better training, basically wanted to be able to do a better job for their patients in not only at their hospital, but in line with what private hospitals were getting around the area. Just to make Harborview as good as it should be.
And remind me, were they bummed when a bunch of socialists showed up to?
No, it seemed like they were very happy for the support.
That's something we've been finding more and more often when we get out there in the community. So what can you do? I recognize a lot of the faces in this room. I think a lot of you are already DSA members, but if you are not one, and this sounds like it might be your bag, you can always join DSA. You can have a voice and a role and a vote in the direction and future of the organization, which is an incredibly fast-growing organization. You can start a local DSA chapter or actually that needs to be amended because YDS, the Young Democratic Socialists, just changed the name to YDSA. So they're sort of the youth DSA movement, which is, I think, mostly college students, but we have someone who's starting a chapter at Seattle University right now. You can join one of the committees. None of those projects were handed down to us from the national office. This was people who decided, you know what would be a really great idea is if we got out there and we did some landscaping, and we did some trail maintenance, reached out to the John Grant campaign to find out if they needed any help. So there are ample opportunities. I mean, when I joined DSA, it was the day after the presidential election, and I was mad and wanted to donate $45 to somebody who was not the Democratic Party. And when I showed up at the meetings and saw that this was something that was just getting off the ground in Seattle, and that there was ample opportunity to make myself useful, I consider that a huge bonus. And I'm doing things now that, goodness, that as a sort of card-carrying introvert, I would have never believed I would be doing. So those things can include canvassing, phone banking, campaigning, protesting, getting out there and increasing visibility, even just wearing your DSA t-shirt around or talking to your coworkers at the water cooler about socialism. All of these things are good. I mean, Democratic Socialists of America, the D part stands for democracy. That means ideally we want a majority of people on our side. It means that none of this stuff is going to happen without widespread popular support. And getting out there and making the case to people is an essential part of that. And there's also you've been working on the labor organizing, the workplace organizing. Can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, we have a couple really good labor organizers within Seattle DSA who kind of give us, as like myself, non-union worker, non-labor organizer, advice on how to organize our workplace in different forms, whether that's going through a traditional NLRB election, trying to start something like that, or if it's trying to just organize power in ways to get gains, even if it's not a formalized union. But yeah, we've been doing that, and it's great stuff. We have great, like I said, great labor organizers who provide a bunch of help, and then other members can come and assist the members who are trying to start something in their workplace.
That's great. And again, that's slow going, and it's a long-term project for anyone involved. But so that's the end of the presentation for now. We have Andrew, what would you like to say?
If you're excited about DSA, but any of that seems intimidating, socialism actually involves a lot of spreadsheets and emails. And so if you are also a card-carrying introvert and are still scared of knocking on doors or talking on the phone with someone about socialism, any one of those committees that needs help, like sending emails or like booking a library room like this, or all kinds of little things that, in private industry, administrators are paid to do that work, and none of us are paid. So what is it? Many hands make light work, or whatever the saying is. So there's tons of things that maybe you bring from your skills, you bring from your existing professional work that are always helpful to the movement.
Or even just spare time and willingness. We saw some of it happening earlier. I've never spent more time in my life arranging chairs in rows than I have in this past few months. So, does anyone have any questions?
You mentioned an informational picket line, so how does that work? I never heard of it.
Informational picket line, Daniel?
I am not super familiar with the mechanics, but they were not on strike. They were raising visibility and were making the hospital administration aware that they could go on strike and that they had the support of the community if they did.
I imagine it's...
Also getting their demands out so the community knew just how reasonable they were.
I imagine that's more of a thing in industries where you're considered essential and where sort of striking is a little bit taboo, like nurses and so on, where you can't just one day shut the hospital down without any warning.